Hello, everyone. My name is Anthony Campolo. Happy to have you here. Today, I'm going to be showing the StepZen at GraphQL Directive. So if you've watched any of these streams before, this is actually what I did maybe about a month or two ago. I kind of showed how you could use this with Redwood.js. And this is going to be a much larger, more built out project with lots and lots of different GraphQL APIs, and it's going to show how it doesn't really matter how many you have. You can just kind of take one, add to the graph, take another, add to the graph. And so this is the whole idea of being able to stitch or federate or put everything together into a gateway. These are a lot of ideas that have been kind of spinning around the GraphQL world for a long time. And if you watched yesterday's Learn with Jason episode, Carlos actually talked about this with Jason, because Jason built out this thing called Gramps a long time ago. So this is a problem that has existed in the GraphQL world for a long time, and I'm really excited to get to work on this tech that is super cool and does all this amazing stuff. So just to give a quick kind of overview, we're going to hit a public endpoint like the Rick and Morty, and then we're going to hit a couple private ones that are like CMSs or hosted databases, and then we're going to spin up some of our own endpoints as well, and we're going to combine all of those into our single graph. So if anyone is out there in the chat, feel free to say hey, and let me go ahead and share my screen and we can start doing this. Okay. All right, so I should have everything I need set up here. I got both the Twitch chat and the YouTube chat over there so everyone can see what's going on. Now this is repo that I've created, and if you actually want to see where this is going, I've got another branch that's kind of the completed state of it. But right now, all it has is a README that's going to outline what exactly we're going to be building out. And if you're kind of hopping in and you have no idea what StepZen is at all, then you're probably very confused. StepZen is a serverless GraphQL layer for any data source, meaning that you can take lots of, what's up, Travis? And you can take databases, REST endpoints, GraphQL endpoints, you can stitch them all together. And then they also have some other directives that let you combine multiple queries into a single query, like at sequence and things like that. So I've been working for StepZen for about 6 months now. And it was actually the first tech job I'd ever gotten. I was originally a music teacher before I did any of this. And I worked on a project called Redwood.js, and Redwood.js uses GraphQL, and that's likely going to be one of the things we're going to be using here to stitch it all together. So go ahead and check us out at stepzen.com, and let's just get right into this. Now, when you have a StepZen project, you are going to have just a schema folder, and you don't even necessarily need a schema folder. This is a convention that I just think is nice because it helps you separate out your kind of base files, which are things like your config and stuff like that. And so let's go ahead and just do that and take a look at what we got so far. And let's there and that. Great. All right, and then we're also going to create just a git ignore. Always want to have a git ignore for all sorts of stuff. So this is just the kind of base project right now. Got a lot of windows going on here. Okay, this is just the base project with an index.graphql and all of our schema files that we're going to use. Now, you don't need to have a stepzen.config.json. If you don't, when you spin up your endpoint, it'll ask you what you want to name your endpoint. But I like to include that just so when you first run StepZen start, it just goes. You don't need to answer any questions on the prompt. And then we also have this config.yaml file, and this is going to be eventually for our keys that we're going to use. We're going to connect to Storyblok, which is CMS, and Fauna, which is a hosted database. And that's why we have this config.yaml, because we're going to get API keys from them. And I just have this thing here at top, configuration set. That's kind of like the base convention. If you don't have that, it'll give you an error saying, hey, you need this. And then the index.graphql is what actually brings together all of these schema files into one big thing that's going to be queried together. So if we just run this, we are still going to get an error. And the reason for that is because we have all these files, we have all the schemas, they're all connected together, the project's set up, but we don't have any queries. So it's saying, hey, you need a query to do something with GraphQL. And the first query we're going to do is going to be for the Rick and Morty GraphQL API. I really like this example as just like a simple way to show people what GraphQL is and how it works, because it gives you pretty basic schema. You have character type, and then you have characters, which then returns an array of those character objects. And then they also have some relations, things like episodes, and they have some filtering abilities and stuff like that. But the purpose of this is more so to show how to combine all these different endpoints together. So each of these things is going to be like really, really simple type, really simple query. The idea being that we want to show the different endpoints connected together, not so much what you can do with the queries, but it's GraphQL. So you can pretty much do whatever you want with it. So if we just do that, we get all this data back. Yeah, the Star Wars API. What's funny is the Star Wars API is the kind of example from the GraphQL docs. That's kind of like the canonical GraphQL example that a lot of people use. But I'm a big fan of Rick and Morty. It's a cool show. Now we're going to just define the types and the things we want to get back. We don't need to do the whole schema. So we have a character type with an ID, name, and then actually I'm not going to do that image, so we can take that off. So right now I just want the ID and the name of the character. That's all we want. And I want to be able to get an array of characters. And we see here, every time we save, this redeploys because it's watching your project for changes. And now we've got our base query here. If you know anything about GraphQL, this should look pretty simple. We have a query, which is a characters query that is returning characters type. And then this is the StepZen's ism. This is what this whole talk is about. We have these custom directives that allow us to hook into different systems. And the @GraphQL directive is, of course, for GraphQL APIs. So almost all of these, you're going to see this /GraphQL on the endpoint. And that's because unlike REST APIs, where you have a different endpoint for each resource, with a GraphQL endpoint, it is a single URL that you send all of your queries to. Now that we got that going, we're ready to actually run our query. And this is going to then return the characters. There we go. So we're getting their ID and their name back. That's pretty cool. If we are combining multiple things together, though, this will lead to a natural problem inevitably at some point, which is name collision. So as Travis in the chat just mentioned, there's also the Star Wars API, and there may be the Pokemon API. So if you have different APIs that are using character, because character is a very generic term, then that could be an issue. This is why we want to be able to prefix our endpoints. And the way we do that is with this prefix thing here. We give it a value and then include root operations. That's kind of related to just how StepZen works with root queries and stuff. And you don't really need to worry too much about that. But if we just copy over all this, then the only thing we need to do is throw this Rick underscore in front of the queries names, and we should get everything back. All right, that's our first endpoint. So right now, as my previous coworker Brian used to say, wow, we turned a GraphQL API into a GraphQL API. Super cool, right? But this is where it really gets interesting. Once you start bringing in other things. Now, Storyblok is a CMS that we actually did a stream with not too long ago. And if you want to check that out, let's see, it should come up. And we had Facundo on and learned how to actually connect to it. We did a long stream showing how to do this. I'm going to kind of blast through it just to get us set up. So on Storyblok, you're going to Storyblok. You can create posts because it's a CMS, so a backend to connect to your posts. And we already have a test space, but I'll just kind of walk through creating a new space, and this is going to be called GraphQL Mashup. And then we're going to create a folder. And then we create an entity. And for the entity, you can select some of these pre-made entities. And we're going to do just a post. And this is going to say, this is a post. Here we got a nice little editor. This is the title of the post. This is the intro. It's kind of short. This is the long text. It's not quite as short. And then once we do that, we can publish it. There we go. Now this is published, and we will be able to connect to it with their GraphQL API. And the way we do this is we have an API key here. And then all these things that I'm showing, I'm going to roll these keys afterwards. So this is going to be the key we need to put in our config.stepzen right here. Okay, so got a little bit ahead of myself. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a configuration. It's going to have a name and a token. And then that token is what we grabbed over here. Place it right there. And then let's just take a look at this first. So these are the types, which is going to be post items, which is going to return the items. The items are post item. Sorry about that noise. I'm in the noisy city of Oakland. And now we have our query, which is going to return the post items, and that is going to be each of the post items. Hopefully that car stops barking. There we go. Okay, now we got a couple more things going on here. So we still have the same endpoint. Yeah, right. And the endpoint is for Storyblok API, and we have a configuration, and the configuration matches what we wrote here in our config.yaml, Storyblok_config. And then we're passing these headers. So if you were to just hit this API with Insomnia or something like that, you would give it a header for token, and then you give the token value like you are our config.yaml. So this is doing all of that for us. And let me just make sure. I'm going to delete that test one as well. Still kind of figuring out where everything is here in Storyblok. Okay, delete this space. Okay, so now we should just get back the data we just created. Okay, so this should be good to go, I think. Now we're going to do this query here, and this is going to be for the post items. It's going to return the items. We're going to get the name, and then we're going to get the content, which is the intro and the title. Did you mean right? And then this actually needs to be and deploying. Great. There is our wonderful post. This is the post, this is the intro, and it's the title of the post. Now we have both of these queries in here. So if I wanted to go back to the other query I just did, and I also want to get the Rick characters, all I have to do is pop it in here. And then now we're going to get everything. We're getting the Storyblok stuff, and we're getting the Rick and Morty stuff. And it's all within this one single query. You just start layering them in, and then you get it. So that's where we really start to see the power of what we got here. Now, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to pop open Fauna DB. Fauna DB is a kind of like a serverless database. So you don't have to host your database. You don't need to provision it or anything like that. You can just kind of spin them up really easily, and they let you create test data really easily as well. So we're going to use the demo data here. And the cool thing about Fauna is it comes with a GraphQL API already baked in. So if we look here, we have this playground already, and they also give you your authorization keys right here. So this is our authorization header, and they give us a token. You had to prefix it with basic. And here we're going to have similar thing. We're going to have fauna underscore config, and then the authorization basic, and then you're going to put your key in there. That is so obnoxious. Oh my God. Okay. This is why I'm begging my girlfriend to move out of here. Okay, so now we're going to do our config.yaml. And now we got our configuration there. And then we're going to grab our key right here. Yeah. Okay, so now we're going to be authenticated. And what we're going to show now is we're going to show mutations. And is there a way to then generate TS types from that? I don't know about with StepZen, but there's definitely tools from like the Guild and stuff like that that can generate all sorts of stuff like that. I think like GraphQL Code Gen could probably do that for you. And like if you look here, we've got this kind of example where they got like schema, and you got some YAML, and you got some types here. So there's plenty of tooling that lets you do that. And I recommend checking that out. And this may be something that we may end up bringing into StepZen just to make it kind of simple and integrated. But I don't really do TypeScript, so not really too big of a concern for me. I know I'm still holding out. Okay. Now what we're gonna do is it's like an e-commerce kind of thing. So we got store, and then we got store inputs. And if we just do this, I'm curious actually if they give you, I think they already give you some test data. So if we want to just find all stores, we can run that query right now. Stores, and then name. Right. So we want the name. But now we see they have some sample data for us, which is really nice. But what we're going to do is we're going to create some of our own with mutations. Now, mutations are the other half of the puzzle piece to GraphQL. We've been doing queries here so far, and queries are great. We need to read data. What if we need to write data? What if we need to update data? What if we need to delete data? Heaven forbid. You have these mutations here to create a store, update a store, or delete a store. And all you gotta do is feed them the endpoint and feed them the configuration, and then the mutations will work just like the queries do. And what I really like about this is it's really easy to test these out on the Fauna dashboard. So Fauna has like a GraphQL interface, just like Storyblok has a GraphQL interface. So anything that has a GraphQL endpoint usually has some sort of playground like we have here. So you can test those directly against your actual database and then test the same queries against your StepZen endpoint. And it's really easy to see when things are working and when they're not. So now we got all this set up. We're going to create something called fake store. It was not configured for mutations. That's a no, did not save. Okay. So now we got that. We were able to actually create the fake store. And it gives you this ID here. That ID is going to be important for the next couple of things we're going to do. So if we wanted to just return that object that we just created back, then we're going to do this, and then we get the same thing back. Now, if we want to update it, we can do that as well. Still want to grab the ID, and we're going to change the name to updated fake store, and it is now updated. And if we want to delete it, then we can delete it like so. And now the store is deleted. So if we then go back to try and search for it, then we'll be able to see that we're not going to have it anymore. Can't get an error. But I do actually want us to have a little bit of data in here for when we query everything. Okay, so now we got some data in there, and that's the fauna stuff. Okay, now this is gonna be the fun part. Now what we're gonna do is we're going to actually create our own serverless GraphQL API that we're gonna host and that we're gonna add in to this whole deal here. Hopefully this part works, because this is a little bit newer and something I just figured out a couple weeks ago how to do. So we're gonna be using GraphQL Helix here. GraphQL Helix is a much newer GraphQL server. So most people use Apollo server or Express GraphQL. Some people maybe use Mercurius if they're more into Fastify. But all of these servers have been around for a while, and the GraphQL spec is actually constantly evolving. So you want to be able to include new features like the @defer and @stream directives and things like that. And so GraphQL Helix is actually keeping pace with the spec and giving you all the new stuff. So this is really kind of the most built out, most sophisticated GraphQL server that is around right now. So what I've done so far is I've created this project here. So kind of a lot of stuff going on here. So let's walk through exactly what's going on here. First, we're just going to have our app server. It's kind of like Express. So if you've used Express, this shouldn't be too scary. And we have a Express object, and then we have some different GraphQL Helix things we're importing for getting the params, processing the request, using the GraphQL editor, and then our actual GraphQL types for objects, the schema, and the string. Our schema is going to be very, very basic. All it's going to do is have a single query called hello query that is type string and resolves to this message here, hello from GraphQL Helix. We then initialize our app with Express, make sure to do that JSON thing, and then this is going to create the GraphQL endpoint. And the thing that makes Helix nice is it abstracts at the highest level, like what is actually happening here from like the perspective of the request. So you have the body, the headers, the method, and the query. So the body is going to be the payload, the headers will be auth and things like that, and then the method will be, and the method, the query will be like the actual thing, the GraphQL query, the mutation, or anything like that. And then you'll have a response, and then it'll be on port 4000. And then we have this handler here. So this is going to use the serverless HTTP library and the serverless framework. So this is just kind of a simple way of getting your any server you could possibly think of into a handler. Now, it is kind of worth saying that this is not necessarily a best practice. It's actually considered a worse practice, because what you're doing is you're creating what's called a lambda-lith. You're creating a single lambda that is an entire monolithic application. It's cool for like hello world examples and demos and things like that. But if you're ever going to do this for a real project that needs to scale, you can't do this. Like, it's just not going to work. It's gonna hit performance issues and cold start issues and all sorts of stuff like that. So what you really want to do is you're going to want to break off your project into different single responsibility functions to do stuff. But for the sake of this example, it's a pretty cool way to show like how it works. And what we're doing is we're importing the app, and then we're initializing a handler, and then basically taking the event and the context and then passing it all through. Now here we've got our serverless.yaml. I'm going to do one other thing too while I'm talking. This can take a little bit of time to do, so I want this running background. Okay. So the serverless.yaml, this is what's called configuration as code. And this is something that if you don't already know about, I think you're going to start hearing a lot more about this, because it's just a really nice way to develop in terms of like the actual deployment step. What we're doing here is we're directly defining what is the deployment. So if you've ever used AWS before, you're like, oh, I know what an AWS region is. That's where my thing is hosted. So I'm on the West Coast, where you use US West 1. Then you can say whether it's like dev or prod. You can tell it exactly which node runtime you want. And then you specify things like the allowed origins for cores and methods. And then you actually define the function itself, which is this handler here. So handler.start, you have a handler file with start. And then we also have these plugins for Webpack to actually build the function. And you can also, if you have like TypeScript, you can do that as well with this Webpack config. So now that we got all this set up, hold our fingers. This works. So the serverless deploy step is what's going to actually deploy it. And as soon as I see that this is not breaking, I'm going to let this run for a little bit. All right, cool. So we got an error. Cannot read property 1 of null. Okay, interesting. Property 1 of null. That's make sure I got files I actually need. So we got that. We got that. We got this. We got all that. Okay. Interesting. Okay, this is also why I have the backup, just in case. So let me just clone this guy down real quick. So you can see me a bit in debugging mode right here. So let's make sure that the project file is set up correctly first of all. So we have server with package.json, webpack.config, and then we've got serverless handler, src. Okay, so this all looks good. So I'm gonna try, actually, yeah, no, that's all good. I'm gonna try deploying from this one, see what happens. Server, go to apps, go to Express, serverless deploy. Let's see. Oh, I gotta edit these first. So, these. And then into Express. Let's see what happens. All right, still an error. Interesting. Cannot read property 1 of null. Huh. Okay. That's really strange. serverless framework, you let me down. Okay. This is all right because the Redwood stuff kind of will show exactly what's going on with this stuff anyway. So we're gonna go ahead now to the Redwood portion. Let's just go ahead and go here. So this part should work just fine. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to spin up a Redwood project. And this is also going to be kind of your own endpoint that is being deployed. And it's going to be connected to a database. Waiting for him to look great. That's so funny. Yeah, no, totally. Yeah, and it's like part of the problem here is that like you have not a lot of examples and stuff with Helix. Is still pretty new, and so I took the Koa example and kind of modified it for Express, and it was deploying just fine yesterday. And the code is absolutely identical, so hard for me to say exactly what's going on there. But for now, let's just go ahead and check out this Redwood thing. So if you don't know what Redwood is, then you're in for a treat. So Redwood, and then let me do one other thing first. If I don't do this first, this is going to cause an issue. We're eventually going to deploy this to Netlify, and on Netlify, delete both of these first. So Redwood was originally created for deployment on Netlify. At this point, you can deploy it in all sorts of ways, which is pretty cool. And the thing that makes it really nice is that it actually auto configures your Lambda handlers. So that thing that I was just trying to do with Helix should be all good. It basically is already has that all figured out for you. So you don't really necessarily need to have to figure out how to actually get your thing onto a Lambda function, because that's kind of where this stuff gets tricky. And also it gives you a whole ORM and database as well. And the way it does that is with Prisma. Prisma is an ORM/query builder kind of thing. And we are able to do migrations as well. So what we're going to do here into Railway. A Railway is a really cool backend as a service kind of platform. And what they do is they give you Postgres, MySQL, Redis, and MongoDB, and you can spin those up really quickly. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a project. And then that project is going to have an add-on. So once we initialize our project, we're going to add Postgres to it. And then we're going to run this command, which is going to inject our environment variable from our database into our Redwood project. And then once we do that, we can run this command here. That's actually going to apply the migration. So this is going to set up our database with a table, and then we will be able to do whatever we want with that database. And this is similar to what you get from something like a Supabase. There's a lot of kind of Postgres as a service type companies right now, although you also get things aside from Postgres with Railway, which I like. And then you've got things like Fly, where you can actually spin up a Postgres container, which is pretty cool. And now once you have your thing scaffolded out, and the generate scaffold user, that's going to build out the whole Redwood dashboard essentially. And now we got our Redwood dev over here. And if we do this, we're going to go to users. We're going to create a very nice gender neutral person here. And then person 2, and then one more person. Okay, so now we got some users. Great. Now we got our users. We can actually deploy this thing to the internet. And the way we do that is with this yarn redwood setup deploy command, which then creates a netlify.toml over here, which gives you all your build commands and whatnot. And then you just need to create a repo. We call this repo StepZen Redwood users. Once you create that repo, you'll want to initialize your Git project, add it, commit it, set the origin, and then push to main. Once we got all that going, we can go over to Netlify here, and this will give us a nice, easy deployment. So you go new site from Git and GitHub, and then here we're going to do Redwood users. And since we have that netlify.toml, we got this stuff already. And then we need to give it our database URL, which is what we injected in over here. And this is a lot of what I showed on the last stream as well. If you're interested in this kind of stuff, I deployed 2 separate Redwood apps and then merged them into one StepZen project, which was fun. Okay, so that's going to take a little bit of time. So, Travis, do you have questions if you're still here? We also have our cool Redwood schema over here. And this is what we're going to put into our StepZen project. Let's put that right there. And then let's go ahead and don't need that anymore. For the 2 separate apps, you connect them to our backend. For the Redwood ones, Lucia? Or for this one I'm doing right now? For the Redwood one, it was like 2 identical Redwood apps with slightly different schemas. So both of them were connected to their own Railway database that I spun up separately. So it's a little bit silly, but at the same time, like, it kind of shows that once you have all these tools together, you can spin up a whole full stack application that then becomes its own microservice. So I called it a mesh of monolithic microservices, because that's kind of what it is. And you can give it any kind of backend you want, and you can connect different backends kind of depending on what your framework and ORM is. So with Redwood, it's using Prisma, and so Prisma is usually for relational databases, so Postgres or MySQL, but they've recently added Mongo support. So there's so many tools and so many different ways of doing this and different things you can kind of stitch together. And it's kind of just comes down to like what the requirements are of your app. I usually say just start with a relational DB, usually Postgres, and then you can kind of go off from there if you need something else. But especially since there's like so many nice Postgres hosting providers now, it's just kind of like, I think, the way to go. So here we have our Redwood schema now in our StepZen project. So we have our user type, which just has an ID and name, and then our query, which is going to have a user's query, which will return those users. And then all you got to do is feed in this endpoint here. Now, what's happening here is Netlify is giving you a kind of convention of how your functions are handled. So this is basically doing the step that the serverless deploy command would do, where it takes your function and it like bundles it and then turns it in. Actually, what it does is it zips it. Like, so there used to be this library called zip it and ship it. they're using ES build now instead of that. You can configure one or the other, but it just takes your project, turns it into a zip, and then puts that zip on like an S3 bucket or something like that, and then lets you hit it with an endpoint, probably with like API gateway or something like that. So this is all stuff you can do on AWS, and you can figure out how to stitch all these services together, or you can use a slightly higher level abstraction like the serverless framework, or you can use the highest level of abstraction right now, which is Netlify, although serverless cloud looks pretty cool as well. So let's check back here on our deploy and see how this is going. It hasn't failed yet, so that's a good sign. So this is doing the thing. It's creating our functions, doing all of that. So this is going well so far. And then what we're eventually going to do is send this one big query with everything. So let's just query the stuff we already got. So if we see here, we have that store ID. So take that out. And we're going to take this out. Now we have the Rick and Morty API. We've got the Storyblok CMS, and then we've got our Fauna store. So this is all good. This is all still working. We're getting our Storyblok post, we're getting our store, and then we're getting our Rick and Morty characters over here. So that is all good. Now, this looks like it just finished. So now we got this set up. That should be it, because I already have the endpoint in there. So if everything went according to plan, I should also be able to add in the users. Get those users back. HTTP error not found. Okay, so that's because I think the repo is slightly different, or is it? Back to Netlify. Where was the Netlify? I had Netlify here somewhere. Okay, so let's see. So we got, I know why, because you have to first give it set the domain name. So here we got domain management. So they let you give it a nice little domain name here. StepZen, Redwood users. And then now we did that. Should be able to run this. And as you see here, it's kind of thinking for a while. That's the cold start in action. And then there is our users. Cool. So that is querying the Redwood API hosted on a Netlify function, which is connected to a Railway database. So you see here now, we're able to connect not only public GraphQL APIs, but also private authenticated GraphQL APIs and custom GraphQL APIs you spin up and deploy it yourself. So essentially anything you can do with GraphQL, you can do with the GraphQL @StepZen directive at this point. You can also do fragments and things like that. So it's pretty cool. This is what I've been working on for like a couple months now, and this is kind of like the culmination of a lot of that work. And Dan on the team has been a huge part of that as well. And this was involved with building out the Everfund stuff. And so if you check out StepZen Everfund, you can see we have a kind of testimonial here from Chris Burns talking about how we're using StepZen now to query all of his Everfund endpoints. And this is an example of the power of all this tech. He has his own GraphQL API with Redwood.js as well. And yeah, so this is kind of where we're at right now with the @GraphQL Directive. If you want to check us out, you can just go to StepZen.com and I think /sign up. Yeah, so you can sign up here. And yeah, that is the whole stream. Almost went off without a hitch. Cool. Thank you so much, everyone, for watching. And yeah, feel free to hit me up on Twitter if you have questions as well. I love talking about this stuff and helping people out building. So I'm AJC Web Dev everywhere on the internet. You can also find my poly work, if you know what that is, on AJC Web Dev, ajcweb.dev. All right. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good day.